Mr. Speaker, I want to tell a story tonight about what happens when an industry with unparalleled greed operates and spends huge sums of money with the result that they are destroying the health and well-being of millions of Americans. And the industry that I am talking about, sadly enough, is the pharmaceutical industry. Mr. Speaker, I think, as you know, millions of Americans today cannot afford the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs in this country. Some of these people will die because they're unable to purchase the prescription drugs that their physicians prescribe to them. Many of them will just continue to suffer, not being able to get the alleviation of their pain because they can't afford those prescription drugs. And others will buy the prescription drugs by taking money out of their food budget or their heat budget and will do without other basic necessities of life in order to purchase prescription drugs. As you know, Mr. Speaker, disgracefully, tragically, the American people pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. It's not even close. Several years ago, I took a number of Vermonters over the Canadian border into Montreal because they could not afford the very high prescription drug prices in our own country. And what they found when we went over the border to Montreal is that the same exact drugs manufactured and sold in the United States were sold for a fraction of the cost an hour away from where my constituents were living in northern Vermont. Some of the women who went with me over the border were fighting for their lives against breast cancer, an affliction that affects large numbers of women in this country. And what they found when they went across the border with me is that tamoxifen, a widely prescribed breast cancer drug, was selling in Canada for 1/10 the price, 10% of the price that it is sold in the United States. Can you imagine that? Women who are struggling for their lives are forced to pay 10 times more in the United States than our neighbors are paying in Canada for the same exact drug manufactured by the same exact company. But it is not just Canada. It is not just Mexico. In the southern part of our state, California, Texas, Arizona, Americans are going across our southern borders into Mexico for the same exact reason that Americans in the northern part of this country are going into Canada. But it's not just Mexico and Canada that have substantially lower prices for prescription drugs. It is every other major country on earth. Mr. Speaker, for every $1 spent in the United States for a prescription drug, those same drugs are purchased in Switzerland for 65 cents, the United Kingdom for 64 cents, France for 51 cents, and Italy for 49 cents, the same exact drugs. Meanwhile, while the pharmaceutical industry rips off the American people, causes death, causes suffering, that same industry, year after year, is at the top of the charts in terms of profits. Last year, for example, the top 10 pharmaceutical companies earned $26 billion in profit. $26 billion. Why is it that prescription drug prices are higher in the United States than in any other industrialized country? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. The pharmaceutical industry is perhaps the most powerful political force in Washington and has spent over $200 million in the last 3 years on campaign contributions, lobbying, and political advertising. $200 million in the last 3 years in order to make sure that Congress does not lower the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs and affect their profits. $200 million. And you see that money spent. You see it in the TV ads in your homes. on your home television station. You see it in the full-page ads in the Washington papers and in papers all over this country. Amazingly, not only are they spending money on advertising, not only do they spend money on campaign contributions, and I must tell you that the vast majority of members of Congress receive money from the pharmaceutical industry. The political parties receive money from the pharmaceutical industry in soft money. But amazingly, the pharmaceutical industry has on their payroll almost 300 paid lobbyists right here on Capitol Hill. Can you imagine that? There are 535 members of Congress, 100 in the Senate, 435 in the House. They have 300 paid lobbyists, including former senators, former members of the House, knocking on our doors every day saying, hey, don't do anything to lower the cost of prescription drugs. Keep our profits high, and we'll make sure you get your campaign contributions. This is an absolute disgrace to democracy, and it is an outrage being perpetrated against millions of Americans who want nothing more than being able to purchase reasonably priced prescription drugs. Mr. Speaker, year after year, senior citizens throughout this country and those with chronic illnesses cry out for prescription drug reform and lower prices, but their cries and their tears go unheeded as the pharmaceutical industry and their lobbyists defeat all efforts to lower prices. Year after year, there's talk, people come up here, blah, 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 blah. And year after year, every effort is defeated because the pharmaceutical industry and their money machine prevents any real reform. Well, this year, it is my hope that it will be different, because Congress is going to build on our successes from the last session of Congress. Last year, this Congress, in a bipartisan measure, overwhelmingly passed legislation which promised the American people that they would be able to buy prescription drugs at the same low prices as do consumers in other countries through a re-importation program. And that means that the United States, in the midst of a global economy, that our prescription drug distributors, our pharmacists, should be able to purchase FDA, safety-inspected drugs from any country where they can get a better price. If drugs are sold in Canada for 1/10 the price, pharmacists in the United States should be able to re-import those drugs under strict FDA safety regulations. In the House last year, the Crowley re-importation amendment, introduced by Congressman Joe Crowley of New York, won by a 363-12 vote. Unfortunately, at the end of a long legislative process, loopholes were put into the overall bill last year that made it ineffective. While the law remains on the books, it has not been implemented by either the Clinton or the Bush administrations. In an increasingly globalized economy, where we import food and other products from all over the world, it is incomprehensible that pharmacists and prescription drug distributors are unable to import or re-import FDA safety-approved drugs that were manufactured in FDA-approved facilities. The pharmaceutical industry and their supporters in Congress, and they're sending out letters right now, they're saying, oh, this is a dangerous idea, we're going to be poisoning the American people. This is absolute nonsense. Let me briefly read from a letter that was sent to Senator Byron Dorgan on September 13, 2000, last year. And as many people know, Dr. Kessler is the former FDA commissioner, I believe, under both former Presidents Bush and Clinton. And this is what he stated in his support of reimportation last year, and I quote, "I believe U.S. licensed pharmacists and wholesalers who know how drugs need to be stored and handled and who would be importing them under the strict oversight of the FDA are well positioned to safely import quality products rather than having American consumers do this on their own. Second, if the FDA is given the resources necessary to ensure that imported FDA-approved prescription drugs are the authentic product made in an FDA-approved manufacturing facility, I believe the importation of these products can be done without causing a greater health risk to American consumers than currently exists. Finally, as a nation, we have the best medical armamentarium in the world. Over the years, FDA and the Congress have worked hard to assure the American public has access to important medicine as soon as possible. But developing life-saving medications doesn't do any good unless Americans can afford to buy the drugs their doctors prescribe. The price of prescription drugs poses a major public health challenge. While we should do nothing that compromises the safety and quality of our medicine, it is important to take steps to make prescription drugs more affordable. End of quote. That's Dr. David Kessler in a letter to Senator Byron Dorgan, September 13, 2000. Mr. Speaker, when the agricultural appropriations bill comes up, perhaps on Thursday, perhaps next week, Mr. Crowley, Ms. DeLauro, and others, and I, intend to introduce an amendment, the Reimportation Amendment, which is the same amendment as Mr. Crowley introduced last year that received, as I mentioned before, 363 votes. We know right now that the pharmaceutical industry's cash register is clicking overtime. Their lobbyists are all over Washington trying to scare members of Congress so that they will not pass this legislation. But I believe that when members of Congress go into their hearts and when they listen to the seniors and the other people back home who are sick and tired of paying outrageously high prices for prescription drugs, who are sick and tired of having to go to Canada and Mexico to buy the drugs that they need, I believe that despite all of the scare tactics of the pharmaceutical industry and their representatives in the United States Congress, that Congress will have the guts to stand up to them and vote for the American people and pass the Sanders-Crowley-DeLauro Reimportation Amendment. Mr. Speaker, when that amendment comes before the floor, it may be the only opportunity this year or next year that members of Congress will have to vote to lower the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs. And I hope and am confident that members of Congress will ignore the scare tactics of the pharmaceutical industry and their representatives and join Ms. DeLauro, Mr. Crowley, and myself and many others from both parties in demanding that finally, after years and years of talk, we lower the cost of prescription drugs in this country and we create a situation in which American consumers do not have to continue paying far more than people throughout the rest of the world for the same exact prescription drugs. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my friend Mr. Pallone for having yielded me the time, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.